Again, to our friends on Facebook, let's start this conference with, well, in the best possible way, with Therese Cory. She's assistant professor in philosophy at Notre University, and, well, she's a very famous person, so there's no need for introduction. So she's going to talk us about Aquinas, and the title exactly is Aquinas on Experience and its Scope, and well, I just leave the word to you, Therese. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Katja, for organizing this wonderful conference. I'm really excited about learning more about experience throughout the Middle Ages. So my paper is just going to get that discussion off to a start by thinking about the notion of experience that's captured in the terms that Aquinas uses that get translated into English as experience. So experimentum and experiencia, cognitio experimentalis is a sort of basket of terms having the same linguistic connection. And I want to look at those and see how he uses them. We find all these terms corresponding to experience in these Latin thinkers, and so I think it would be helpful to think about what they mean and the extent to which they can be mapped onto our notion of the language of experience. So I'm going to look at two main usages, first of all, that Aquinas has for the term experience, or terms that get translated as experience. And of the two of them, one of them does, in fact, I'm going to argue, correspond closely to our contemporary usage of the term experience, but with a few interesting differences. So, for instance, experience today tends to be applied exclusively to sensation. We talk about sensory experience, and we would think it would be a little bit strange to talk about intellectual experience of an essence, but that's, in fact, how Aquinas uses the term, is intellectual experience. He doesn't use it for sensory experience. But we'll see that there's a close link to sensation there. Now, his concept of experience, as we will see, involves the following three key claims. First, that there's a kind of presence that sense objects have to sense, which the objects of intellect can also have to the intellect itself. That's the first claim. Second, that intellects can be said to have experience of both material and immaterial entities. And third, that what distinguishes experiential from non-experiential cognition has to do with how the object exercises causation on the intellect. So the term experience is tracking a certain kind of causation. So my procedure will be as follows. In the first part, I'm going to distinguish the two main kinds of experience that recur in Aquinas' thought, isolate the one that's important to us here, and examine some of the cases of cognition that he describes as experience. The second part is going to ask the question, what kind of cognitive presence is implied in Aquinas' use of the term experience? And how is this kind of presence achieved in contrast to cases that we would consider as indirect knowledge? And then the third part is going to ask, what difference does experiencing something make to the knowledge that we can have of it? So I'm not going to say anything in this paper about the influences that might lead Aquinas to use these terms in different ways. I'm curious to know if people have suggestions in that respect. But I simply want to document his usage here. All right, and you've got a handout with a lot of the relevant text and some breakdown of the procedure of the paper on it in your folders. So first of all, Aquinas' experiential terminology. If we look through use that most wonderful tool, Index Thomisticum, we can find that there are over 300 occurrences of the term experiencia in some form in his works. Cognitio experimentalis appears about 13 times. There's about 130 occurrences of various forms of the verb experiri. And then experimentum is the largest at 400 occurrences. It's often used as a noun describing a mental state of the knower, and only very rarely as a passive, and we only find very rarely the passive participle of experiri to describe things that are being experienced in this particular way. So we have a case of the use of the term sensibilia experimenta. So there's two broad ways in which these terms get used, and it's not possible, I want to really underscore this here, it's not possible to take the language that I just described, experimentum, experientia, experiri, and divide it up so we say, oh, one kind of usage appears, is restricted to this set of terms and the other to another set of terms. Aquinas uses all of these different terms to describe both of them, and there's a close relationship to these two usages, as we're going to see. Okay, so the first sphere of usage is to describe an imaginative disposition which corresponds to Aristotelian empiria. This is often translated experimentum in Latin, although Aquinas also calls it experientia. This comes from Metaphysics 2 and Posterior Analytics 2:19, and it's a disposition that's formed in the imagination for the acquisition of science. So here's what Aristotle says. This is my translation of the Merbecki translation of the Posterior Analytics. He says, from sense, indeed, there comes to be memory. From memory of the same thing repeated many times, there comes to be experience, experimentum. For memories are many in number, but experience is one. And from experience, and from every universal already resting in the soul, one over many, whatever is the same in all those particulars, there is a beginning of art and of science. When Aquinas comments on this passage, he distinguishes experimentum very explicitly from knowledge of the universal as a principle of art or science. So he gives this example. When a doctor has considered that this herb has healed feverish Socrates and feverish Plato and many other singular humans, he has experience. But when his consideration arises to the species of herb as healing the feverish simpliciter, this is grasped as a certain rule of the art of medicine. So this is not the kind of experience that I want to spend most of the paper talking about, but I want to make a few observations about it because they're important to differentiating this way of thinking about experience from the one we're going to look at in more depth. So we might ask, okay, so what exactly is this kind of experience? What Aquinas seems to be describing here is a disposition in the imagination acquired through frequency of repetition. It's not formed discursively. That's very important. There's not a kind of quasi-syllogism that puts this disposition together. Rather, he describes it as those the similar cognitions. We have the similar, let's say, encounters with similar things that begin to stick together and generate a unified disposition in the way that water, as it gradually drips on a rock, begins to carve a deeper and deeper channel for itself. The phenomenon that it's attempting to explain, I think, is the recognition of a pattern that sets up expectations for how similar individuals are going to behave. So what he's describing is something similar to the way we use the term experience when we say that this lawyer has experience with adoption cases. That he's had many encounters with them, so he knows what to expect, what kind of pattern they conform to. Or a carpenter who has used a certain brand of paint before. I have experience with this paint. It's some sort of pattern of encounters so that you have an expectation of how something is likely to behave. But it's also important, I think, that he uses the term consideratio because it seems as though you have this experience in the sense of empiria, not when you merely sort of develop unconsciously these patterns, but when you have paid attention to the pattern. So when the doctor is trying to heal a feverish patient and says, well, I've noticed that I had this other patient who was healed by this herb, and another patient, it has to be sort of paying attention to the pattern, and the attention to the pattern seems to be important to attributing to someone this empiria. All right, so what these texts are doing, I'm going to call this kind of experience, or this use of the term experimentum and experientia, I'm going to call that empiria, the Aristotelian empiria, to distinguish it from the other ones. And what these texts are doing are setting up a relationship between these three kinds of cognitive dispositions: memory, empiria, and then scientia, which is, properly speaking, the abstraction of a universal that involves the familiarity with necessary truths concerning some unified kind of thing. Okay, so I want to take empiria and set it aside and look at the other way that Aquinas uses the term experiencing, experientia or experimentum, to refer to a certain kind of acquaintance with something real. So on your handout, you see a text by text from De Malo 16:7-12, where Aquinas says this: experience, and here he's referring to empiria, experience proceeds from sense insofar as sense is cognitive of something present. And in that respect, experience is attributed to demons, not because they perceive something by sense, but because they cognize something made present, which they had not previously known. So the question here has to do with whether demons can know things by experience. And this shows up in Aquinas' angelology and demonology as a repeated question. So here we see there's a derivative sense. He's taking the notion of empiria, and then he's constructing from that notion a sort of extended sense of the term experience that's closer to the way that we use the term. So what we can notice here is these two usages and how they're related to each other. He wants to say that what's important about empiria, such that we might want to ask, can an intellect, a purely intellectual being, can it have something like experience? What the important feature that he picks out is that the act proceeds from sense. And why would it be important that the act proceeds from sense? Because sense cognizes something present which was not previously known. So that's the aspect that he wants to zero in on and say, well, from empiria, we need this aspect that is an intellectual act, and here a more than sensitive act, some act of a higher order, that picks out something present that was not known before. And now we've got an extended use of the term experience to describe that kind of acquaintance with a thing that's present which was not present to you previously. So we see those, we can articulate that as two conditions for experiencing something. First, the thing must be present, and second, the thing must be not previously cognized. And we notice, I think this is particularly important here. The kind of presence he's interested in is clearly the kind of presence that an object has to sense. Nonetheless, this extended sense of experience that he's introducing is not something that he attributes to sense. He uses it for acts of a higher cognitive power that have the kind of presence to their object that sense has to its object, if that makes sense. That's what's going on here. Okay. So what that means is that any cognition that satisfies, sense is used as a kind of paradigm for the kind of presence that we're interested in here, and any cognition that satisfies this notion of presence can be described with sense terms. And this helps us understand why Aquinas will frequently use terms like videre or intuere or even sentire, specifically to talk about intellectual acts. And these are not sort of vague, hand-wavy metaphors that he sometimes uses. There's specific context where he thinks it's appropriate to use the language of sensation to apply to intellectual acts. It's specifically coming from the kind of presence that has to do with that the senses have, and that's operative in this kind of intellectual experiencing. And it's crucial to note when we think about that second condition, that the thing experienced must be not previously cognized. That experience, Aquinas says, does not apply to God. So we can't talk about God as having experiencia or experimentum in this sense, even though it's very clear that he thinks God's knowledge satisfies the first criterion. God does have this kind of presence to realities that the senses have to those realities. But there's a kind of imperfection in his notion of experiencing, the encounter with something not previously cognized, that obviously he's not going to attribute to God. It's not as though God moves from not knowing to knowing. So I think it's interesting here in light of the later usages of the term experience that we saw in Galileo and in Bacon, to talk about gathering information, learning about a thing. That aspect of moving from the unknown to the known is also operative here in Aquinas' concept of experience. All right, so let me give you a few examples of how he uses the term experiencia or experimentum in that particular sense of an acquaintance with something present that was not previously cognized. There's a whole list of them on your handout, and I'm going to run through them quickly. So one large group of texts that talk about, use the term experience in this way, is when he talks about how angels and demons cognize contingent singulars. So here we have, again, if we return to the text that we just looked at, which is repeated again in your handout, where he says, sense experience is, in that sense, comma, experience is attributed to demons, not because they perceive with sense, but because they cognize something that becomes present. So here we can see that there's a kind of intellectual immediacy to a singular, the singular that an animal with senses would know by sensation. The language that he uses here, to try to stress this immediacy, he'll say that a singular is known as it is in its being or as it is here and now. He gives the example in particular of knowledge of an eclipse. So an astronomer might be able to predict an eclipse. He might know the eclipse in its singularity, right? Without ever beholding it. It will happen because he knows it in its causes, right? And Aquinas emphasizes knowing a singular effect in its causes is not enough for having that kind of intellectual immediacy to the singular itself. What we need is additionally to have the presence to the singular as it is in itself. He describes it to experience the eclipse as it is here and now. He really likes to index it to time and place. Here and now, beginning now and ending now. Okay, so that's one category. Another frequent use of this terminology shows up when he describes our own internal activities and affections. And often what he's doing here is appealing to these internal experiences or acquaintances that we have with our own acts and desires as evidence for claims that he makes about psychology, about how the human intellect works and how imagination relates to intellect, and how cognition and affection are structured. So, for instance, we have the language of Christ does not know sin by experience. So, in doing something, you have a acquaintance with the, let's say, the moral character of your act, so by experience. He has another reference here regarding the frequency of receiving the body of Christ in Holy Communion. He says, if someone cognizes experientially that his love grows in fervor from daily reception, cognizes, so there again, an experience of the growth of one's own affection, that's an internal experience. Again, he says, and this is to justify why we have the claim that we have an agent intellect and a possible intellect. He says, we experience that both the act of understanding intelligibles and the act of making intelligibles actual are in our power. So experiencing ourselves as the agents of our own acts. Then he has a terrifying and humorous remark here. It is laughable for one to become a teacher of perfection who does not know perfection by experience. So, high standard to live up to for the ethicist. Experience bears witness. Do you have experience as a source of testimony again? And this is typical, I think, of his usage of when he's talking about these sort of psychological internal experiences. Experience bears witness that from habituation something becomes easy and delightful that was previously hard. And then there's an interesting use of the term here when he talks about experiential certitude as something that is had through the senses when someone sees through the senses what he previously did not see. And this is the closest he gets to attributing experience to sensation, in fact. So this is a mode of certitude different from the certitude of demonstration, he says. And that's why there's a kind of interesting context here. This is from I believe this is from an early text on the commentary on the sentences where he's talking about the knowledge of Christ, and he wants to explain why it would make sense for Christ to grow in experience even though he already has the perfection of all knowledge in his intellect. He doesn't need sense experience. And he changes his view over the course of his career, but in this early text, he justifies the necessity of using the senses for Christ because he says it's delightful to encounter with the senses what you did not previously sense. So it's kind of sweet there. But it's interesting because that gives him a sort of category of experiential certitude or sensory delight that's distinct from what we have in the intellect. So now when we think about the usage here that we've seen in all of these different texts, there's a couple of conclusions that we can draw. First of all, notice that the objects of experience do not need to be material on Aquinas' account. So these acts of willing and knowing are in fact immaterial acts. He says we have experience of them. That's important. Secondly, we can also sort of notice a pattern of usage here. When he uses the term experience, he tends to be using it in the case in which the object is singular. So we don't really find him using the language of experience to talk about our knowledge of essences. And I think part of that is because he's modeling this, because of this connection to sensation that's in the notion of empiria, that he's taken over into this extended notion of experience. So there seems to be a pattern in the way he's using the term. All right. So that's just a sort of overview of how he's using these terms of experientia and experimentum. But here's what I want to focus on for the last part of the paper. It seems as though what we've seen in his use of experience is a certain kind of intellectual presence to a singular entity that was not previously encountered, has not been known before. The thing that I think is particularly interesting for our purposes is the kind of presence that he has in mind. So we've seen him in this notion of experientia, this extended sense, constantly pointing to a certain kind of immediacy, encountering the thing as it is, here and now, this kind of concreteness. So we know what he's talking about phenomenologically, right? But can he give us any criteria for what it means to have that particular kind of presence? What does it take to be present in that way with our intellects to something? And so what I want to do is I want to focus just on this aspect of presence, which it turns out can apply not only to our, if we look at just that one criteria, it can apply not only to our knowledge of singular things, but also to our knowledge of essences. So that allows us to sort of broaden out the notion of presence that he's using. So we're going to move away from the term experience as he's using it himself and focus in on what I want to call experiential presence, which can apply not only to singulars but also to universals or essences. And this is the kind of intellectual immediacy that Aquinas tends to name using verbs of sensation, such as videre or intuere or sentire. So what exactly distinguishes these sense-like intellectual acts from other kinds of intellectual acts? That's what I'm going to look at in the rest of the paper. Okay, so Aquinas has various ways of describing the kind of presence, this experiential presence or experiential access that I'm interested in. In particular, he describes two ways in which we access something. The distinction, the way he expresses it is sometimes we know through another, per aliud, and that's a cognition of something mediated by an experience of something else. So for instance, if you hear a snap, the sound of a snap from your kitchen, you know there's a mouse trap in there, you know it's just about the right time of the evening, you assume that there is a mouse in your mouse trap. And so there you haven't actually You have no immediate presence to the mouse. You have an immediate presence to the snapping sound, and through that you infer that a mouse is there. So there is an indirect access to the mouse. The alternative would be to know something in itself, in se ipsam. That's the language that he uses. And there you go into the kitchen, you see the mouse in the trap, and now you're having you're knowing the mouse in itself and not through another, namely through the sound of the trap. Often he uses this language to distinguish reasoning to God's existence from the conditions of existence of creatures, as opposed to the kind of intellectual immediacy that we have to the divine essence in the beatific vision. So the paradigm case of cognizing something in itself, or accessing it experientially, having this experiential presence to it, is of course sensation. But for Aquinas, the senses are not the only cognitive powers capable of accessing realities experientially. Our intellect can also cognize certain realities in themselves, including even essences abstracted from sense and imagination, such as rhinoceros, grasped without their physical and individuating characteristics. And he even describes these cases of understanding an abstracted essence as intellectual vision. This is kind of extraordinary. But he doesn't think that all intellectual cognition counts as intellectual vision. In some cases, we only know the essence indirectly. So what is the condition under which my intellect experientially accesses some extramental essence, intellectually sees it or understands it in itself? And Aquinas' answer, curiously, this is Summa Contra Gentiles 341 on your handout, is that the essence must be cognized by its own likeness. So he says, a thing is cognized in the manner of intellectual vision whose likeness exists in the intellect, just as the likeness of a thing corporeally seen is in the sense of the one seeing it. Now, I think it's worth spending some time spelling out this criterion. It's extremely important. And one puzzling thing about the criterion is that Aquinas holds that the condition for knowing anything at all is always that the sense power or the imagination or the intellect receive the likeness of the object. So all cognition depends on receiving the likeness of the object. So why is he focusing in on, as a special criterion for a special kind of intellectual vision, that the likeness of the thing exists in the intellect? It seems to be a general cognition criterion. But for Aquinas, and I think this is absolutely crucial and usually overlooked. For Aquinas, there is a difference between an intellectual likeness that is produced by the thing itself and a likeness that's produced from something else from which we draw inferences about the thing we're knowing. So he says this is from, this is Summa Theologiae Prima Pars 56.3 on your handout. He distinguishes between cognizing something, quote, by the presence of its likeness in the cognitive power, as when a stone is seen in the eye, by the eye because of its resulting likeness in the eye, as opposed to cognizing something inasmuch as the likeness is not taken immediately from the cognized thing, but from something else from which it results, as when we see a man in a mirror. End quote. The point is that a likeness is, if we say that we're knowing X, let X stand for the thing that we're knowing, the point is that a likeness is X's own only when X is the cause of the likeness. Using a different formulation, but I think it amounts to the same thing, is sentences 449.2.1, where Aquinas says that in order to have intellectual vision, what is known and the likeness whereby it is known must have the same specific ratio. So he says, in order for sight to cognize white, it must receive the likeness of white according to the specific ratio of white, though not in the same mode of being. For the form has one mode of being in sense and another in the extramental thing. But if the form were yellow were in the eye, it would not be said to see white. And similarly, in order for the intellect to understand some quiddity, there must come to be in it the likeness of the same specific ratio, even if the mode of being is not the same. Now, as everyone knows, ratio is said in many ways. But here I think same specific ratio, the way he's contrasting it with different mode of being, arguably means something along the lines of determination to a specific kind. And I think the point here is this: in order to see X intellectually, what you need is a likeness whose determinacy is the same determinacy that X has in itself. So to access experientially an essence that is determinately rhinoceraic, if one might excuse the awkwardness, the knower must be formed with a determinately rhinoceraic likeness or intelligible species. But how does a likeness get this rhinoceraiety? There can't be more in the effect than there is in the cause. The rhinoceraic determinacy of the likeness can only be brought about by a determinately rhinoceraic agent. And thus, I think what Aquinas is doing here is setting up a causal connection between the thing that causes the likeness and the determinacy of the determinacy of the likeness itself as a broader application of a narrow application of the broader principle that every agent makes its patient like itself. And we now see that not only is it the case for Aquinas that every agent makes its patient like itself, it's also the case that the likeness of X, properly speaking, can only be caused by an X agent. Right? Only a rhinoceros acting on our sense and imagination has the causal power to make our intellect rhinoceros-like. Okay, so what I want to propose then is that Aquinas defends a causal criterion for experiential access, namely that I intellectually experience X-ness if and only if I cognize X-ness by an intellectual likeness that is directly caused by X. And directly isn't meant to rule out the intermediacy of the sense and imagination, but it at least has to start with some power of the human of the same human being. Okay, very briefly then, because I imagine I see I'm running out of time here. So let me just say briefly why experiential access matters. It's certainly the case that Aquinas thinks I can still cognize a rhinoceros. I can have thoughts about rhinoceraiety. I can formulate descriptions of rhinoceraiety, even if I've never encountered one. There's been no causal activity of the rhinoceros on my senses. So why do we care? Why does he care so much about maintaining that causal connection? And I think what's crucial to Aquinas here, there's a few things on the, there's one challenge that Aquinas might face. We might say, well, look, the casual zoo goer, right, goes and looks at a rhinoceros and goes off and looks at a whole lot of other animals and comes back with only the vaguest notion of what it was that he encountered at the zoo. And then you have Albrecht Dürer here who, only through other people's eyewitness accounts of rhinoceros is able to put together this extremely meticulous and not entirely accurate, but astonishingly accurate picture of a rhinoceros, doing much better, I submit, than the average zoogoer who has an experience of a rhinoceros. So why should we say that that anything special in intellectual vision is accomplished by the experience of a rhinoceros? And so I think it boils down to something like this. For Aquinas, someone who doesn't have the experience of experiential access to a rhinoceros is never going to be able to, will always be formulating their concept of the rhinoceros in terms taken from other entities. So if we think about what is going on in this picture, this woodcutting from Dürer, the whole construction is based on comparisons, like a very large pig, covered with something like armor, has a horn like other horned animals that he might have actually encountered. And so the content of his concept is always indirect. He may be able to draw an accurate picture, but on Aquinas' account, his concept of rhinoceros is always going to lack that rhinoceraic determinacy. What is the uniquely rhinoceros way of being an animal? And here we have a kind of composite description, a very accurate, definite description of a rhinoceros. without a real grasp of what it is exactly about the walking and the moving and the shape and the behavior of a rhinoceros that is rhinoceraic uniquely in itself. And I think for Aquinas, I'm just going to say this and then and leave it at that. For Aquinas, that's what this experiential access gives us, that what this causal connection gives us, is that character of what it is to be an animal in this particular way that can never be fully captured simply by putting together very sophisticated comparisons. Thank you very much.